today we're going to be doing a workshop around supporting our young people with tics. And as Beth said, my name's Kelsey Odgers. I'm a clinical psychologist from the Psychology in Schools team, which is part of Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust, which is the mental health trust. And I'll just hand over to Beth to introduce herself.
Hi, so I'm Dr. Beth Mosley, consultant clinical psychologist with NSFT.
Brilliant, thanks, Beth. So we'll just start by thinking a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So in terms of the overview. So this is really just an initial introduction around understanding what is Tourette syndrome and what are tics, and then just thinking with you all about what might be helpful. And I guess we wanted to recognise at the start of this really is that you and your young people might all be in a different place in relation to tics. So we saw on those previous Slidos that you've all got children of different ages as well. So some of you may have already done some research in this area. So some of this initial stuff might be a bit of a reminder of some of that, whilst some of you this might be completely new. So we really hope to hear from you all as much as possible on those Slidos, to really hear about your experiences and things which might be useful for other families to be aware of. So as Beth said, we'd really encourage you to join us on Slido if you can. And I guess it feels important to acknowledge that this workshop is about supporting your young people with tics, but just to say that unfortunately there's not necessarily a cure to get rid of tics, but there are of course both things that you and your young people can do which can really reduce the impact that the tics are having on them. So we hope today will be a bit of a starting point for some of that, to generate some of those initial ideas. And I guess finally, just to say, you will be getting the slides through as well as a recording. And this was originally a slightly longer presentation because there was other things that we wanted to include, but we did have to cut the slides down. So there are just a few others in the slide deck that you can refer to should you want to, and we'll be signposting to them throughout, as well as some useful resources that we wanted to share. Great. So it's useful just to get a sense, firstly, of what you already know about Tourette syndrome. And I guess if you don't know anything, then that's fine. Just put that on there. It'd be really useful just to get a sense of what people are already aware of. And again, for those of you that have just joined us, we use slido.com. So if you could pop slido.com either into a mobile device or a PC and just use the code on screen, it's great to get as many of you interacting as possible on Slido. So it's a neurological condition. Great, yes, it is. So we're going to be talking a bit more about that on the next slide. So uncontrolled movements and sounds. Yes, great definition of tics there. Any other thoughts about what people already know about Tourette syndrome? And for those of you that have already put some thoughts, please feel free to add some more. Hereditary, yes, so there might be a genetic element to Tourette syndrome. So just to say that a lot of the information that are on the next few slides are from a charity based in the UK called Tourette's Action. It's a great charity that has loads of different resources. So we're going to signpost you to that in the resources at the end of the presentation. So if you wanted to find out more about this, you can later on. So as someone highlighted on that previous Slido, yes, Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition. So it's not a mental illness. And Tourette was a French neurologist, who you can see on the slide there, who first discovered this condition, which caused people to tic. And we know that those with Tourette syndrome have tics. That's how it's identified. And they are involuntary movements or sounds. So we know that the person can't help doing those tics. So that's just a really initial introduction, as I said, to Tourette syndrome more broadly. So how do you get it? So what are the causes of Tourette syndrome? And I guess the truth is that scientists don't know the exact causes of Tourette syndrome. So it's quite complex. tics. As someone highlighted on that Slido, that there is some evidence that Tourette syndrome is an inherited condition, but we know that it's not just down to a single gene. There's some other research as well that suggests that there's some differences in the brain for those that have Tourette syndrome and those that don't. And you can see there on the image, the sort of pink area called the basal ganglia. There's again some research that suggests there's specific differences in that part of the brain, which you can see is near the base of the brain. There's also some stuff that suggests that chemicals in the brain that transmit nerve impulses, so those neurotransmitters, may also play a bit of a role. But I guess, again, we don't know exactly what all of those causes are, and it's very complex. But I guess it's important to let you guys know that all cases of Tourette syndrome are really a mixture of both genetic and environmental factors. And just again to highlight, there's some more information about that at the end of the slide deck if you wanted to know a bit more, as well as through some of the resources. So thinking about the prevalence of Tourette syndrome, so how common is it? And again, this information came from Tourette's Action. And I think it's really useful actually for both you as parents and carers, as well as your young people, to really know about this, so how prevalent it is, because I think sometimes experiencing tics can make you feel very alone in that experience. So I guess it's important really both looking at these statistics, but also being mindful that, you know, we're running this workshop today because we know that there are families like yourselves who have young people who are experiencing Tourette syndrome and tics. So we know that it affects around 300,000 people in the UK, and that 1 out of 100 school children have Tourette syndrome. We know that it's much more common in boys than girls, so about 3 times more boys than girls have a diagnosis of Tourette syndrome. And I guess the other important thing to be aware of, and of course there will be individual differences within this, is that we know that typically tics develop around the age of 5 or 6 in Tourette syndrome, and then they tend to get worse sort of just before puberty around the age of 10 to 12. So I know that some of you sort of indicated that on the Slido that might be the age range of your young people. So it's just being mindful of that. But I guess the good news is that for many young people, the tics can often reduce as they sort of approach adulthood, and in some cases can sort of disappear fully. Although, as I've said, there might be some individual differences within that for different young people. Okay. Thanks, Beth. So I really like this slide. So this is thinking about who has Tourette syndrome, and we're specifically thinking about sort of famous people or celebrities. So you can see there from the images a range of people. So that's the singer Billie Eilish, for those of you who've heard of her music. Lots of young people have and like her music. There's also footballers. So you can see there, that's Tim Howard, who is the Everton goalie, I'm told. There's also famous people in history as well. So Mozart, there's other musicians, there's also famous poets and comedians as well. And I think what's really useful about this is that you can almost share this with young people and say, you know, could they find out which famous people have Tourette syndrome? And actually quite a few celebrities have spoken about their experience of tics. So I know that Billie Eilish in particular, there's a few videos of her talking about tics. There's also a famous YouTuber called Casper Lee, which lots of young people are aware of. And he's got some great videos, which again, we'll signpost to at the end, of him talking about his experience, but also interviewing other young people about their experiences. And I think this really tells us the importance of really focusing on strengths, because we know that often young people and adults with Tourette syndrome often have sort of quick reaction times and are really great at picking up new habits or new skills. So things like playing an instrument or playing a sport. So I think, again, this can be really useful to share with young people, because often the focus can be on all the difficult things that come with Tourette syndrome, whilst, you know, neglecting or forgetting some of those strengths. That can be a really nice thing to share. And I guess the other thing just to say in our experiences, you know, telling young people about these famous people or showing them some of those YouTube clips can be a really nice way for them to feel connected to other people so they don't feel so alone in that experience. But also it's been a nice way for them to be able to tell their peers or speak to their peers about Tourette syndrome and tics, which we know can be really helpful just to reduce that pressure that they might feel to control tics around peers, for example. So we just wanted to really share that. And as I said, there's other famous people there that we haven't mentioned. So if you wanted to find out more with your young people, you can. Okay, so moving on now to think a little bit more about tics. So what tics does your young person have? And it'd be great to get as many of you as possible on Slido, just commenting there. People can comment more than once as well. So you join us at slido.com, that would be great. So vocal tics. Are there certain vocal tics, if you wouldn't mind sharing? Clearing the throat, yeah. Yeah, so vocal tic there, joints locking. Yeah, so different parts of the body perhaps. Do more of a motor tic. You can see some others typing, which is great. Throat clearing, head shaking, tripping, shakes, vocal. Yeah, so young people often have a range of different tics, which we can see there. There's already some overlap. So with throat clearing tic. Yeah, so they can look very different, which again we'll be talking a bit. So sounds, yeah, phonic sounds, throat clearing again. So you can just see that shared experience there, that your young people aren't alone with that tic. Other people typing, which is fantastic. Yeah, tilting head continuously. Yeah, so those head tics again, someone else has put their head shaking, so slightly different tic but same part of the body. Okay, maybe other young people experiencing other having other diagnoses as well. Sudden loud noises, yeah, so different sorts of loud noises it sounds like, so some other vocal tics there. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for sharing. And I think you can really see there some of the overlap just with a few of you that you know, the similar tics that your young people are experiencing. So exactly that, what are tics? So we know that they're muscle movements, which we call motor tics, or noises, which we call vocal tics, which many of you are already aware of. And we know that young people with Tourette's can't help doing the tics, so they're not doing them on purpose, they're involuntary. We know that they can be fast and repetitive, so they can happen again and again. So you may notice a new tic and then it often will happen again and again. And we also know that tics can change over time, so they can come and go. And we're going to be saying a bit more about that on the next slide. And as you can see there on the slide, we classify tics into either vocal or motor, as many of you sort of were highlighting already on the Slido. And we also think about them in terms of simple or complex tics, which I'm going to say more about. So those simple tics are more those sudden, brief, repetitive movements that involve just a limited number of muscle groups, so often to one set of muscle groups. And they're more common than complex tics, which on the other hand are more distinct coordinated patterns of movement that involve several muscle groups. So an example of motor tics in Tourette syndrome might be things such as eye blinking or other eye movements, sort of facial grimacing, a head or a shoulder jerk, as some of you were sort of highlighting there on the Slido. Whereas those more complex motor, so movement tics, include things like facial grimacing combined with like a head twist or a shoulder shrug, so sort of more than one muscle group. And other things might be sort of touching objects or hopping, jumping, bending or twisting. So perhaps things that you wouldn't always necessarily think are tics can be more of those sort of complex motor tics. And then thinking about the vocal tics. So we know that lots of you said about that sniffing or throat clearing tic, sorry, that would be a simple vocal tic. Other things might be sniffing, barking, or grunting sounds, whereas those more complex vocal tics might be repeating own words or the words of others or phrases, and also a swearing tic, which again I think is well known in the media. There's a huge misconception that that's, you know, one of the few tics or a very common tic, when actually we do know it's more uncommon than what people think. So that would be an example of a complex vocal tic. Great. Thanks, Beth. Okay. So in terms of waxing and waning, so we know that tics come and go. So what that means is they change over time, and you may have already experienced this, particularly for those of you with older young people who may have experienced tics for a long time. So we know that they can change in both severity and in frequency as well. So how sort of pronounced they are, but also how often they occur. And I think this can feel quite confusing, as there isn't an explanation for this waxing and waning, this coming and going. And it's a normal thing that happens for people with Tourette syndrome. And I guess what we really wanted you to hold on to when we were sort of thinking about introducing this waxing and waning with you is just hold on to that if there's a tic that's really bothering your young person now, it probably won't stay around forever. So it will follow that natural waxing and waning. So I just want you just to take a few seconds just to think about if there are any tics that your young person used to experience that are no longer bothering your young person now, that perhaps were really bothersome to them before. There might be a previous tic that again is reduced in severity or frequency or has completely disappeared that used to be really, really bothersome and problematic. So I guess again, you know, it's really useful to hold on to that if there are currently other tics that are hanging around, you know, that they should follow that general waxing and waning pattern and will come and go. Slide, please. Thank you. I'm not sure if it was happening your end. Okay, so thinking about the tic alert. So we know that most people with Tourette syndrome, so not all, as we'll come to, they experience a strong urge in their body in the place that they'll do the tic before the tic happens. And this has been compared in the past to a mosquito bite. So for those of you that have been bitten, I'm sure it's all of you, you get bitten, and then after, you know, several hours or maybe a day, that bite becomes really, really itchy. So the itchy feeling would be what we call the tic alert. So that sensation you get. And the scratch that you do after you get that itchy feeling would be the tic itself. So it has been compared to that, as well as a sneeze. So again, when we need to sneeze, we get that sort of tingly feeling or whatever sensation it is in our nose, and that would be the tic alert. And then the sneeze itself would be the tic. So these feelings, we're calling them a tic alert, but they're sort of formally known as premonitory sensations or urges. And these are only relieved after the tic has been carried out, but it usually keeps coming back, which means that the young person has to tic again to make it go away. So again, we can think about that in terms of this mosquito bite. The itchiness is there, we itch it, we scratch it, it goes away, but then generally it does come back again. So we keep needing to scratch that itch to make that feeling, that sensation feel much more comfortable. And there are a range of different sort of tic alerts that young people have described. So the examples might be sort of an itch in the eyes before the blinking tic, or a dry or sore throat before grunting or throat clearing, for example, where it might be a sensation in the neck before sort of a head movement tic. And young people have lots of different words for this. Other young people might not have a word to describe what it feels like, but just know that there's sort of an uncomfortable feeling or sensation where they're going to do the tic. So majority of young people do experience this tic alert, although not every child will. So around 80 to 93% of 8 to 90-year-olds with Tourette syndrome experience this tic alert. And they tend to occur about 3 years after the initial onset of tics. So for those of you whose young people have just recently started experiencing tics, this may not be something that they're sort of experiencing at the moment. And treatment for tics is all around this urge. So it's about the young person tolerating the urge to tic without doing the tic itself. So this is a really important part of that. So we'll just have a slide in relation to that. So are you aware if your child has a tic alert? So this is just a yes or no Slido. Yes, so there's one person saying that they are aware. Okay. Be great to get a few more of you on Slido, just to get a sense of that. Okay. So the majority saying no at the moment. One person saying yes. So it might be that you've had this conversation before, this was something you were already aware of, and it was just, you know, your young person perhaps isn't experiencing that at the moment or can't describe that. Or it may be that this is a new sort of concept and perhaps something to explore. So this is just the final slide before I hand over to Beth, who's going to think more about some of those practical things that you and your young people can have a think about. So we know that some people with Tourette syndrome are able to stop or control or suppress their tics for a short period of time, particularly in more social situations, so places like the classroom, if they try really hard and concentrate really hard. But this can be really uncomfortable and tiring for young people, particularly at first. And I guess related to that, what we also know is that tics might be less noticeable or might be happening less frequently during activities that require a lot of concentration. So things such as playing a sport or playing an instrument or doing other activities they enjoy. And this can often be really confusing for teachers and other adults and other pupils. And I guess what we know is this is a really normal thing that happens. You know, when that concentration is in a different task, we know that tics reduce. And we also know that young people can suppress their tics for a short period. Not all young people, but some can. So it's really important just for you to be mindful of that as parents and to educate other people on this. So just because a young person can control their tics for some of the time doesn't mean they can in every situation. And I guess what was really important for us to say, a bit of sort of myth busting, is that many parents often worry that if their young person is trying to control tics in certain situations, that this might make their tics worse or more frequent in other situations. But actually research tells us that this is not the case. Okay, so it's a really important thing to hold on to. But as we've said, we know it can be really tiring, take a lot of concentration for young people. So if you're aware of your young person sort of doing this, particularly at school, for example, or after or during family events or parties or time with peers, it can be really useful for them to have some downtime after that, because it can be really difficult when young people are tired and exhausted from trying to control their tics to sort of manage those big emotions. So thinking about that with your young person, you know, what could their downtime look like to try and help them relax when they're perhaps just come home from school or come away from a big event or other situation where they've had to or they've felt they've had to control their tics. And of course, this can be different for every young person. You know, for some young people, it will be spending time alone in their room. For others, it will be snuggling up with animals or being with you on the sofa, whatever it might be. But just important to think about that with your young people, you know, what they might need to support them to sort of reduce the impact of tics and the tic control on them. And just finally to say, before I hand over to Beth, that we have a myth busting slide also at the end of the slide deck if you wanted to sort of learn more about other myths as well. So great. So I'll now hand over to Beth, who, as I said, is going to think more about what you and your young people can do to support them with their tics.
Thanks, Kelsey. Perfect timing. Okay, so this section of the presentation is really going to be thinking about the support elements. We're giving you a little bit of background information on tics. And again, as Kelsey said, it's such a big topic. We really struggled with giving you enough information but not overloading. And again, we're happy to run a kind of part 2 if people feel that would be helpful, because again, we're not entirely sure of how much our audience has already had this information. So what we know is these are some of the key areas, and it's not really rocket science as such. But what we know from the work that we've done with young people with Tourette's, as well as kind of the more general research, is that really knowing as much as we can know as parents and as some adults and family members who might be involved in young people's lives who may have tics, is learning as much as we can about tic disorder or Tourette's. And again, as Kelsey said earlier on, the Tourette's Action website is really amazing. It has so many resources in lots of different formats. So it's got written resources, it's got leaflets that you can share with family members, you can share with school. It's even got a wonderful PowerPoint presentation that your child could potentially do with school, or school could do on their behalf as part of an assembly. And also there's lots of video information, YouTube information as well, to kind of create the different ways of learning really, and as well as support groups and opportunities to meet up with other families with young people with Tourette's, and other young people with Tourette's to meet other children with tic disorder or Tourette's. And there's some lovely stories and accounts of how valuable that's been for those families and those young people. So I would encourage you to look at that website as part of this process of really learning as much as you can. And when Kelsey and I meet with families, we tend to kind of really get to know tics well. They're like not a taboo topic. They're just, we want to know everything about them. And often when Kelsey was talking about strengths earlier on, we want to not just know about, you know, the tics themselves and what they might get in the way of, and when they can be most tricky for the young person, for the family, for others. But we also want to know about the young person's particular strengths. Most young people I've worked with tics have had an amazing skill in some area, and it might be something that people haven't explicitly acknowledged or kind of said, oh yeah, you know what, so for example, we know quite often that reaction times for young people with Tourette's and tic disorder are much faster. So for example, a young person I worked with was absolutely brilliant at clay pigeon shooting. Another young person I worked with was so good at certain computer games where they had that absolute speed of action. And because we know in some ways the way the Tourette's is affecting the brain is it's sort of not having that slowing down that often many people experience who don't have tic disorder. So the brain is very quick to respond, which means that you may be able to think of some of the skills and talents that your child have, which is going to be kind of based on some of the strengths that their brain has because of tic disorder. So learning about the good bits as well as the more challenging bits and making sense of it. And as Kelsey was saying, thinking about other people, other adults who have managed to, for example, if you think about a football goalie, you know, your reaction time has to be absolutely incredible. It's quite possible that he wouldn't be a famous football goalie if he didn't have tic disorder. So again, like Mozart, for example, the skill and talent that he had. So I think there's something there about learning about Tourette's and also and tics, and learning really about your young person and some of the elements of their skills and talents, which may be kind of helped by that as well. I guess the kind of being compassionate, understanding, and kind is really important. We're going to think a little bit about the impact of tics on family life, because they can be very, very frustrating and annoying. They can come along for the young person at the time that they least want them to, and they can be quite disruptive, and that can be frustrating not only for the young person but for other people in their lives as well. So kind of taking that position of being understanding and kind, you know, is often helpful, and doing some separation between the tics and the young person. And I have often talked with families who say they've almost given the tics their own name. So they've called them a different name, and they've said, I'm really sorry, I'm so cross. It's not you, it's whatever the name of the tics are. So that they're really helping the young person understand that the distress they're experiencing or the frustration they're experiencing is not linked to the young person. It really is linked to that tic being pretty tricky for them at that moment in time. Young people have great ideas about how we can help. And, quite often there are certain pinch points in the day. There are certain times which are quite predictable when young people struggle more, and their tics can become more difficult. For example, going to sleep at night can be a real challenge for lots of young people I work with, where they're actually just trying to settle down and their brains start to gear in and think about the worries of the next day. And then they start to have one of their vocal tics, which is really frustrating, annoying them. And then that kind of anxiety escalates. And then it's thinking together collaboratively about, oh, this is a really tricky time of day, or if it's coming back from school or a particular activity where you might notice that the tics are particularly difficult, is thinking about how can we help things be a bit easier, and what do you think you could do, and how can we help you do that? So I'm gonna talk a little bit to that in a minute as well, some more concrete ideas about them. And this notion about the downtime, I just think it's really important that tics don't stop a young person being able to do the things that are important, like get on with, doing their homework and being able to be involved with family life and taking responsibility for doing family chores. So we don't want tics to prevent our children from being engaged in their life fully. But we also do need to acknowledge that our children may need more time to recover from a really full-on day at school, or going to a friend's party where they may have been working quite hard to manage all that extra stimulation and manage their tics as well. So this opportunity to make sure that after quite intense activities, or activities that require quite a lot for our young people, that we build into their routine. And again, we can go back to asking them help. Look, I've noticed that when you get in from school, that's a really tricky time for you. What do you think will help you, your body, relax and have some downtime? So I've got a young person I work with who actually had a sensory sleeping bag, and they used to just go into their sensory sleeping bag when they got home from school for about 45 minutes. They'd actually go on their phone and watch their favorite show, which was just low key input. And that 45 minutes literally then meant the rest of the evening would go really well for the young person and for their family. And every young person's different, but typically if we're wanting our young people's relaxation response to kick in, we're going to want down regulating activities. So not playing a game of Fortnite, because although that's really engaging and stimulating, it's probably pushing our children's stress response up a bit. But maybe doing some activities, which could be, like, I know another young person I work with just likes to have half an hour in their bedroom with their dog, and just chilling out and doing something. They might still have their phone with them, but just doing something, and then from that place they can get re-engaged with family life. So I think that you can do that. You can kind of work those things out. And you've talked about having 11 to 13-year-old children. They're the kind of conversations that you can have with them about what helps, what works for you, rather than making assumptions about what you think will be helpful and work. And if you can do that in an understanding and curious way, when you're not feeling stressed and they're not feeling stressed, then you're in a really good place to come up with a plan, get it down on paper, and support your young person to do that. And if there are times when you've kind of let the team down because you're struggling and you've got a full-on day, you can take ownership and say, I'm really sorry I've not been able to help you do what you needed to do tonight. It's just a really tricky time. And there's something about that, if you as a parent can apologize for when you get it wrong, it makes it much easier for your kids to get it wrong, and much easier for them to say sorry too. And I guess this key statement at the end here: it's not fair to ask a young person or any person with Tourette syndrome or tic disorder to stop ticking. And I think, I'm sure that many of you have had experiences where maybe somebody at school might have said, just stop doing that. And sometimes with a young person when they've just starting to develop tics, it might be that people have said that more frequently. And I think sometimes for parents, you can get frustrated, and I know that for one family I work with, that would be during a film, a really quiet bit in a film, that a young person's vocal tic would become really noisy, and it was difficult for the rest of the family to hear the film. And there were times when a sibling would go, "Oh, for God's sake, we just stop doing that." And so it's not fair to ask a person with Tourette's to stop ticking, but sometimes it might happen just because of the kind of pressure in families. And so it's just trying to be mindful of that. And again, going back to that kind of holding in mind those principles about apologizing and being kind and compassionate, and acknowledging when you may have, as another person in the family, got it wrong. So just on that topic, really, how do tics affect the family? Because obviously there's lots of potential ways they might affect the family. You may have more than one child in your household, and I know that I've worked with lots of families where there's quite a number of children, different ages, and one sibling might kind of find the tics really frustrating. Young people share bedrooms, or meal times can be tricky with tics. Or film times, for example. So sometimes it can have an impact on other siblings. Great. So for this family, that the family are coping well with it. And I guess it's not necessarily just about tics. I imagine if your child is struggling with some other difficulties, anxiety and worry, those things can be equally frustrating sometimes in families. Okay, so the impact on the family at the moment for those of you on this call is you've got really supportive families, and there aren't as many frustrations. And so that's really helpful to know, and that's great for your young person. And I think with the whole waxing and waning, it can be that there are times when a particular tic can come along and be quite intense, and that can have more of an impact, and then there are other times when perhaps it just kind of fades into the background. And so for this family, there's an impact on a younger sibling. It can be really difficult. It can kind of make someone jump, I guess, if a young person's making a loud noise. And if you've got a younger sibling who might not necessarily understand it, that can be quite tricky. Again, Tourette's Action's got some lovely materials and stories to help explain to other children and younger children about Tourette's syndrome, so that can be very helpful. And I had a family that we were able to explain that they were having a particular difficult time with a certain tics, and actually they were able to come together as a family and talk together really in a really compassionate and caring way about some of the challenges the tics were making, and how they could kind of help the young person and one another to manage that. I thought that was such a lovely example of kind of taking the heat out, because I think they'd got into a situation where things were getting quite tricky every day, and they took the heat out of it by kind of coming together when they weren't stressed and having those conversations, and then they all felt like they were on the same page. So I think it's just helpful to hold these things in mind, because sometimes things like the tics waxing and waning, some of the challenges can wax and wane too. So for you as a parent, how do your child's tics make you feel? Okay, so can feel quite anxious for your young person, which sounds very, very, something we often, when we talk about when we're talking and meeting with parents, is concern for the impact of the tics on that young person managing their life and having that additional struggle to manage. Again, I think if your young person has tics which might hurt themselves through repetitive actions, that can again be quite anxiety provoking. I know that certain tics, for example, a neck jerk tic, young people can get quite significant muscular pains, or even certain tics can cause physical injury if they're repetitive tics, which have got quite a lot of force. And so for another family here, sometimes just general frustration. And I think it's that lack of control, isn't it? And not necessarily knowing from one day to the next, or one, part of the day to the next, how much a particular tic or might have an impact on something. And yeah, absolutely. It's just an additional a struggle for a young person to be having to think about how they manage their tics within that school environment. We know that schools are highly, pressurized environment on lots of different levels, the pressures of learning, and also the pressures, of course, of the peer groups. And so I think they are often difficult environments for children across the board. They can be. So having the additional pressure of having to suppress tics whilst trying to work in a classroom can be frustrating for a young person, and can worry a parent. So let's have a quick think about what makes tics better or worse, because I'm sure you'll have observed that there are times when tics might be more pronounced. So for example, we know that worry, stress, excitement, hunger and tiredness can kind of increase the rate that a young person might have their tics. And I've met lots of families where birthdays and Christmas is a real time where the family have had to come up with solutions, because the anticipation of the event is so big that often they might have to open some presents on Christmas Eve to help kind of spread out the excitement, so that it kind of reduces the amount the tics are getting in the way of the young person being able to enjoy that event. And obviously we kind of know that when the stress system is kind of active, that worry and stress and strong emotions can lead to tics being more tricky. And again, things like hunger and tiredness. So young people having a really tricky night's sleep. So some families have really worked out that if sleep is really affected, you get caught in a vicious cycle, because the tics can then be more difficult, that can make sleep more difficult, and so trying to support good sleep is obviously sometimes a really helpful way of reducing those problems. And again, we know that ensuring that young people have enough downtime, enough opportunities to do some of those activities that really help them have something we know is called flow. So a lot of young people that Kelsey and I work with have potentially an interest in art or music or sports. And during the time that they're doing those activities, they are tic free. And so making sure that the young people have those opportunities to do those activities is really important. And with sleep, we do run another parent workshop on sleep, and we've got a recording of that. So if that's a challenge for anyone on the call today, then that might be worth having a look at. But creating a really good routine around sleep and actually supporting our children to learn some relaxation techniques can also be really helpful in kind of improving that sleep quality and reducing the impact of tics at bedtime. So just really a question for you on this call, and you can answer with more than one of these, I believe. What are the things that might make tics worse for your child? So stress, anxiety, or excitement, tiredness, change for one person. Again, change. And I'm just thinking about the age group, the majority of people on this call, 11 to 13. So I'm assuming that there may be some young people who are about to transition to high school. And there might be some anxieties about that change from the primary to the secondary school environment, where you're going to potentially have a different peer group and different expectations in the day around movement, around school independently, and having different teachers and more teachers who might not necessarily have a good understanding of your young person's tics. So again, for the majority of you, you recognise that anxiety and worry and change very much go together as making tics worse. So again, we've got a number of workshops that might be helpful for you to have a look at if you haven't already, on anxiety, also dealing with uncertainty and managing change. So in fact, we've got one coming up in July, which is sort of in preparation for the summer holidays, because for some young people, the lack of structure in the summer holidays can actually be really unhelpful, and they can quite struggle with that transition from being at school and going into the summer holidays. What about what makes tics better for your young person? So if you've tried some of these, fantastic. So, you know, we've got a nice list here of options. So what makes tics better for your young person, have you noticed? What are some of the things that help? Okay, so distraction, routine really helps, and again, the summer holidays are idea. Yeah, that can be a struggle, can't it, when there's been a shift in routine, even for some young people going from the school week to the weekend can be a difficult transition, because there's a less routine at the weekend. Often with those families, we often look at how can we put a bit more predictable routine in, but help our young people also develop some flex so that they don't become too rigid with that. So for lots of you, distraction and routine and exercise are really helpful. And what we know is from the research is that, yeah, absolutely, as you've identified, those things are really helpful. So opportunities for physical exercise, really important on lots of different levels. So particularly if a young person's had a day where they've been, I suppose, in a situation where they've not been able to have enough movement to help them, to help their bodies kind of really process some of the stress that they've had in the day. We also know that focusing on a specific exercise can also be, or activity can be really helpful. For example, young people have said that when they're playing, and you've probably experienced this too, playing an instrument or singing, or taking part in a particular sport, or even sometimes playing a particular computer game, a young person can really see that their tics are not present at all. And so making sure our children have opportunities to have that tic-free time is really valuable. Even just sucking on a sweet or chewing gum or having a fiddle toy can sometimes be helpful for a young person to help reduce their tics. And one of the other things we know about physical exercise is we know it's really helpful for processing some of the stresses of the day, but also it's good at building self-esteem and confidence. So if we can help a young person engage with physical exercise, which is linked to some other activity which they might be really passionate about, whether it's football, or I know for a young person I work with, horse riding was one of the things that really was a wonderful experience for them, and helped build lots of confidence as well, and kind of had a therapeutic value because they really enjoyed working with the horses as well. So it's kind of finding things, physical exercise and movement, that's going to be meaningful to your young person. Just playing badminton in the garden, you know, and just having a knock around, dance. So it's finding things that really appeal to your young person, that they're going to have the motivation to do, so you're not trying to kind of force them into doing it. And also, many of you mentioned worries and anxiety can get in the way with tics. So it's kind of making sure that anxiety and worry are not getting in the way of young people doing some of these activities that are really valuable to them. And again, just avoiding overly caffeinated or sugary drinks. We know that caffeine can have a negative effect, can increase tic production. So it's just thinking about that diet, it can also be really helpful. So one of the things that we tend to do when we work with young people across the board really, but also with young people with tics, is kind of really focus on building in some kind of skills around learning to manage our bodies, learning to relax, because what we know is if we're going to be feeling anxious or worried, and you might have we might be worried. A lot of young people talk about how they've got a lesson and they're really worried about their tics beginning to get worse and disrupting the lesson, disrupting their concentration, and then their worry about that happening makes the tics more likely to occur. And then they kind of start to sort of the tics start and their anxiety goes up, and then they might need to leave the room, which can then be really frustrating if they were looking forward to really wanting to engage in that lesson. So one of the things that we do with young people is teach them about the power and the value of slowing down breathing, because we know that when we're feeling stressed and anxious, one of the first things that happens in our body is that our breathing rate increases and gets faster. So if when young people start noticing that they're having those thoughts or tensions, whether it's at bedtime or it's in a lesson, then what they can do is, as we encourage them to, I'm noticing I'm having that worry, I'm gonna really focus on slowing my breathing down so that my body doesn't get caught up in this cycle of getting more and more stressed, and then my tics are more likely to be a problem. So with this technique, it's called box breathing, because what you're trying to help, you can give your young person a piece of card, like which is in the shape of a square, and you can just say, as they run their finger along one side, right, inhale for 4 seconds. So in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. And you get that nice rhythm where, and a young person, sometimes young people like to just draw around, like their finger around something, so that they feel like it's just helping them track that change. And we know the counting and the kind of focusing on the breath can be really helpful for young people to take them away from and there's, again, it's a form of distraction as well as helping the body. So something that you can find on loads of different things on YouTube, TikTok, will be on box breathing. So encouraging your children to learn some of those techniques and practice them when they're not really stressed. So doing box breathing when you're relaxed and getting the hang of it, because it does feel different from normal breathing, is really important. And then in a more stressful situation, your young person is much more likely to be able to use that. Okay, so some of the things that we know are really helpful that we can do to change the environment is, and it's not always possible, but if we know and we look at like what might be particularly difficult, we look at the week for a young person, we can identify some situations that routinely increase tics. We can think about how we might reduce those situations so that our young people don't have to be in that situation repeatedly. So there might be just a quick win by reducing the number of situations where those tics might increase. Again, reducing things that might unintentionally reinforce tics, and that might be an accidental thing. So if your child, for example, when they have a particularly difficult time with tics, might then not have to do their homework or not do an activity that they don't really want to do, that can unintentionally reinforce that tic. So remember about the downtime and giving space, but always try and bring your child back to still doing things that you would expect of them, but do it within a time frame that's going to be respectful of their challenges with tics that day. And then if you've got a situation which you know is problematic for tics, but it's very difficult to change, for example, going to school, it's thinking about reducing the impact of that situation. It's looking at creating enough activity or breaks. So again, if you've got a young person at school and they're going up to high school and you're thinking about how they can be supported in that more busy environment, it's thinking about ensuring they've got a kind of safe space to go if they want to have some quiet time where they can tic without feeling overlooked, and also potentially have more breaks built into their day. And of course, kind of teaching our young people relaxation exercises and ways to manage their body when they're feeling distressed can be really helpful. And if we're thinking about peer groups, ensuring that we provide really good and we support our schools with really good resources so that they take responsibility for educating the peer group of your child, teachers and others. And again, Tourette's Action's got some fantastic resources to help with that. And typically what we find in our work is that getting a young person engaged in doing that, I've helped a number of young people pull together a presentation for their classmates, and then they've gone and done that with the help of a teacher, and they've found that incredibly empowering and confidence building. So those types of things can be really helpful. And then some more specific advice for school, and I will be finished in 2 minutes. So I'm sorry, I'm running over a little bit. Really, again, it's about providing them with enough information and about how tics can affect learning. And again, Tourette's Action have a fantastic, really detailed worksheet which explains things in quite a lot of detail, especially for young people who might struggle with their organizational skills around Tourette's or tic disorder. And also there's a really nice small leaflet which is really accessible and easy to read as well. Thinking about where your child might be seated in the classroom, so just kind of having students seated at the side rather than the front can be helpful, or too far away at the back. Making sure young people have a safe space to tic during the school day, making sure that young people are not getting out of certain activities if they're having problems with their tics, but instead school are really providing that more support for that young person if required, rather than just exempting them from the activity, ensuring that they are providing the support for that for your child to actually complete those activities, is also again quite important. Okay, so we're on our final slide now. So the take-home message really is Tourette's is a neurological condition. We know that there are different types of tics, and you've described those nicely. Really just thinking, and it sounds like all of you are in this place of being really kind and compassionate and helping your young people, thinking about the power and value of structuring in opportunities for downtime, thinking about strengths for young people, thinking about passions and what's important to young people, making sure they've got enough time to do the things that they love, and then thinking about how we might be able to change the environment in which tics can occur is also useful. So for those of you who are still here, thank you so much. Just the last few questions really are about the helpfulness of the session. And again, we are really happy to run a second session, which we could cover some of the information about. There's loads of things we could go into so much detail into really practical things, but we couldn't include it all in the hour. So we kind of cut out probably another hour of this. So we're really happy to run a second workshop, which might cover those things in more detail and be a bit more practically focused. So if you feel that'd be helpful, then please email into our email address, which I believe should be available on Eventbrite, and just let us know that, and then we can think about pulling that together for you and running that in the autumn term. So what are the two things you'll take away from this session? Again, we sometimes have to condense things down to even less than an hour, so we will know what to not take out of this presentation, this workshop. And also from your point of view, if you can think of two things, quite often those are the two things that you'll go away and you're more likely to try out at home. So it'd be really lovely just to know what are two things that you've learned from this session, or you'll take away from this session, perhaps do a bit more of, do slightly differently at home, or might be confirmation that you're doing everything you can. Great, so that's really helpful to know. And I think the challenge we find in life is, and it's the same for us, so this advice applies to you as parents, you know, when we're feeling stressed and under pressure, and when we're worried and anxious, we got a lot going on, that tends to be when our downtime activities and our activities we enjoy go out the window, because we kind of get consumed with those. And that's almost the time that we need to try and find a way of prioritizing them even more. So it's a really difficult balance, because we know the power of time and how it can slip through our fingers. So setting up a routine and sticking to it. So there are lots of predictable problems, aren't there? So it's thinking kind of and quite creatively, and I think children are great at solving problems, and if you can get around a table and get some pens out and some paper, you can kind of come up with lots of ideas together about how you're going to create that routine and make it a collaborative activity, make it fun, you know, so that's great. So yeah, and letting them lead that, because some of what we think is good downtime might be different for our children, what they want to do. So someone who's feeling very new to this, that's great. I hope today has been helpful. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And our last question really is, oh, we haven't got it on there. So we just got some lovely resources that we'll share. So what you'll do is you'll get the YouTube film, you'll get this PowerPoint information, and this has got loads of lovely resources. So the leaky breaks, that's one thing I should have said on one of the slides. There's a fantastic website, which is the Leaky Breaks website, and they've got lots of films and lots of information. So some of the things that we started to talk to you about, like for example, thinking about not giving the tics lots of attention. I think I didn't even mention that actually, but that's really covered in lots of lovely detail with the leaky breaks resources, because we know sometimes that if the tics get lots of attention, they can grow and become bigger. So there's lots of really practical tools in here which will hopefully help, and a lovely CBC program as well, and also some podcasts. We've got some books here, which are really great books, depending on the age of your child. And if you want to do, for the parent who said this is all new to them, the Chowdery book is really lovely. It just covers everything in lots of detail. It's really practical as well. So I'd highly recommend that. And that's available on Amazon. So that's the one in the middle. Again, we've got some nice resources for young people, and fact sheet about exam stress, some lovely films. A guide for young people, some nice films with I think is it the guy you mentioned earlier who does a lovely film, doesn't he, Kelsey?
Yeah, really nice films of him sort of talking to other young people about their experience, and they're all different ages as well, so I think lots of things other young people can relate to.
And I think the fact that Tourette's, as young people get older and go into adulthood, tends to reduce is really good for young people to see that. And lots of these films are with adults who are young adults who are kind of talking in a quite a fun way about where they're at now and how they've managed it. And you can really see that for them, the tics are part of their life and part of their identity, and that's really positive, and it isn't getting in the way of them living their life to the full. And I think that's really inspiring for young people, and reassuring for you as a parent as well. We've got some resources for schools as well, and some really nice key facts for young people and for pets. And we've got just information about how it's diagnosed here, what some of the co-occurring conditions. So we know that there are young people presenting with Tourette syndrome can have experienced some of these things that are on the slide here, and are just a bit of myth busting as well. So when that all comes through, which it normally comes through once it's uploaded onto YouTube, so within a week, then hopefully that will also be helpful, and we've given you some tasters of things you want to look into more. So today is really about giving you a bit of a taster of it, because an hour is not quite long enough really to cover everything, but we hope it's been helpful today. And thank you for being such a great audience and taking part. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks everybody. Have a good day.